morning of July 10th, 1940, a westbound British convoy moved slowly through the narrow waters off the Kent coast, the stretch soon known as Hellfire Corner. German radar had spotted it. The order came back: vernichten, destroy. 70 aircraft crossed the channel. British radar saw them 30 minutes out. Squadrons scrambled, and the long, quiet struggle for the skies over Britain had begun. This is episode 15 of our long-form journey through the Second World War. In our last episode, we followed the fall of France, the miracle at Dunkirk, and the uneasy weeks when Britain stood alone against a continent under German control. Tonight, as the evening settles around you and the weight of the day begins to lift, we turn to one of the most legendary chapters of the entire war, the Battle of Britain. We move through the carefully cultivated myth of the Luftwaffe's invincibility, the hidden weaknesses on both sides, the young pilots climbing into their Hurricanes and Spitfires, and the invisible web of radar that watched the skies. It is a story of reputation and reality, of courage measured in minutes of fuel, and of a small island nation that refused to yield. I've shaped this narrative with care, so it can hold your attention while letting the tension of those summer days slowly dissolve into calm. If these episodes bring you comfort as you wind down, a like and a subscription help more than you know, and I'd love to hear where in the world you're listening from tonight. Take a slow breath, and let's begin. The summer of 1940 left behind a story that would outlast the war itself, a legend shaped as much by deliberate deception and accumulated dread as by the actual combat waged above the green fields of southern England. In the years that followed, the Battle of Britain settled into a kind of mythology, a confrontation between a small and beleaguered island nation and the most formidable aerial power the modern world had assembled. The Luftwaffe, as that story came to be told, was overwhelming in numbers, in technical mastery, and in the ferocious momentum it had built sweeping across the continent. It had annihilated the Polish Air Force, driven Allied armies to the sea, and leveled cities with a speed and completeness that made ordinary resistance seem almost futile. That image of German air power, inexorable, beyond meaningful challenge, had been constructed long before the first bomb fell on British soil. It was manufactured with patience and skill. The Nazi regime understood with cold clarity that fear is most useful when it arrives in advance of the weapon itself. Through the latter half of the 1930s, a quiet and deliberate campaign unfolded across the capitals of Europe and America. Foreign dignitaries, senior military officers, journalists of influence and public figures were received in Germany with studied hospitality. They were guided through factory floors arranged for maximum impression, escorted past rows of aircraft on well-ordered airfields, shown evidence, carefully curated evidence, of an industrial capacity that seemed to dwarf anything the Western democracies could produce. Those visitors returned home with altered perspectives. In the offices of government ministers, in private dining rooms, in the careful exchanges between ambassadors and their superiors, they described what they had witnessed. The telling amplified the seeing. With each repetition, the Luftwaffe grew larger, more disciplined, more inexorable in the minds of those who had only words to go on. It became, in the shared imagination of the Western world, something approaching an elemental force, one that would arrive when it chose and could not, in any realistic sense, be met. No visitor carried more cultural weight than Charles Lindbergh. His solo crossing of the Atlantic in 1927 had made him the most celebrated aviator of his generation, and his assessments were received with the gravity his reputation demanded. In September of 1938, he toured German air installations and production facilities. Afterward, he composed a formal memorandum addressed to Joseph Kennedy, the United States ambassador in London. The document was precise and grave. German air strength, Lindbergh wrote, surpassed the combined air power of every other European nation, and the margin was widening. Germany already possessed the capability to destroy London, Paris, and Prague. England and France together lacked the modern aircraft required for effective defense or credible counterattack. His hosts had arranged the visit with considerable skill, revealing what served German interests and withholding everything that did not. Even so, measured against the actual balance of forces in 1938, Lindbergh's reading of comparative air strength was, in its broad outlines, substantially grounded in reality. Where his analysis failed was engaging what the Luftwaffe could actually accomplish against a large, sprawling modern city, a far more layered question than it appeared. But such distinctions did not travel well. What moved through the drawing rooms and ministerial offices of London, Paris, and Washington was the blunt, vivid conclusion. It required no elaboration and resisted challenge. The warning found receptive ears. It confirmed the beliefs of air officers in Western nations who had already concluded that massed bomber formations were the decisive instruments of modern warfare. It deepened the anxieties of civilian leaders who feared they were already too far behind to recover any meaningful ground. Slowly, incrementally, the idea of the Luftwaffe as a force without rival ceased to be a claim and became, in the minds of many, an axiom, something one repeated rather than debated. And then events seemed to confirm it. In the autumn of 1939, the Luftwaffe descended on Poland with devastating efficiency. Within days, organized Polish air resistance had effectively ceased. Warsaw sustained catastrophic and widespread damage. The following spring brought Rotterdam, a prosperous, vital port city, reduced to rubble and fire within a single afternoon. After Rotterdam, doubt itself began to seem like a luxury that the facts no longer permitted. A particular quality settled over European capitals in the weeks after Germany moved on Poland, a quality of silence that was also in its way a form of comprehension. People who had followed the news from the East had hoped, in some private corner of their thinking, that the reports were exaggerated. They were not. The Luftwaffe had performed in Poland with a swiftness and completeness that left no room for comfortable qualification. September of 1939 brought aerial destruction on a scale and at a pace unlike anything the modern world had witnessed in quite that form. Polish airfields were struck in the campaign's opening hours. Aircraft were caught on the ground before dispersal orders could be carried out. What survived the initial onslaught encountered overwhelming numbers once it reached the sky. Within days, organized Polish air resistance had effectively ceased as a coherent force. Warsaw absorbed a prolonged and punishing bombardment. Observers who attempted to describe the damage found that measured language seemed almost dishonest. The reality was large enough to resist understatement. Across Europe, the lesson being drawn was unmistakable. An air force standing in the Luftwaffe's path would be swept from the sky. A city chosen as a target would be broken. What unsettled, informed observers most was the tempo, the sheer speed of it. There had been no extended negotiation between resistance and outcome. The result had arrived before most observers had fully registered that the contest had begun. Then came France. In the spring of 1940, the Luftwaffe operated in close coordination with armored columns. shattering defensive positions, disrupting supply lines, driving columns of soldiers and civilians into chaotic retreat. Allied air forces, among them units of the Royal Air Force, attempted to mount a response. Their losses were severe. The gap between what the Luftwaffe could impose and what its opponents could answer proved, in the field, to be exactly as wide as the propagandists had long been claiming. Watching it happen removed the last traces of theoretical distance from the question. And then came Rotterdam. On a single afternoon in May of 1940, much of the historic centre of that great Dutch port city ceased to exist as a functioning urban space. German bombers arrived in organised waves. The fires that followed merged and spread across neighbourhoods at a rate that overwhelmed any organised response. When the smoke settled, the scale of what had been done was so complete that it entered the imagination of every Western government as a kind of reference point, vivid, permanent, and deeply frightening. The Luftwaffe was no longer a reputation carefully cultivated through arranged factory tours and carefully managed memoranda. It had inscribed itself into the physical landscape of a European city, and the inscription could not be argued away. Against this accumulated evidence, the position of the Royal Air Force seemed, to most observers, precarious in the extreme. Its fighter strength had been described in intelligence assessments and in press reporting alike as seriously depleted by the fighting on the continent. Morale in certain units had been characterized as fragile. The working estimates that circulated among senior planners on both sides of the Channel suggested the Luftwaffe could field approximately 4,500 first-line aircraft to the RAF's 2,900, more than half again as many aircraft, standing behind a record of performance that Poland, Norway, the Low Countries and France had made impossible to dismiss. The question being asked in government offices and command posts and quiet conversations alike was a direct one. How could an air force fighting from a position of such apparent numerical disadvantage expect to hold the sky above an island that Germany now bordered from the south and threatened from the east? How long could any force sustain the losses that a sustained Luftwaffe offensive would impose, when replacing those losses required time and industrial capacity that the Germans appeared to own in abundance? The answers offered by surface analysis were sobering, and yet surface analysis was, as it so often is in war, an incomplete account of the situation. Behind the comparison of raw numbers lay a tangle of factors, some visible, some hidden, some barely understood even by those closest to the decision-making, that would ultimately shape the battle in ways the arithmetic alone could never have predicted. The full picture was considerably more complicated than the headline suggested, and within that complexity lived something that the long years of German propaganda had never quite managed to manufacture: genuine grounds for uncertainty about the outcome. For all the weight of those numbers, 4,500 against 2,900, the contest assembling itself above the English Channel bore only a passing resemblance to the simple arithmetic that governed public perception on both sides. The two forces preparing for what would become one of the defining aerial struggles of the century were, in ways that mattered greatly, far more evenly matched than either the German High Command or the watching world had been led to believe. Measured aircraft against aircraft, the quality of British machines compared favourably with what Germany could put in the air. Where fighter command lagged in quantity, it could, on the right terms and in the right circumstances, compete in capability, and in certain specific domains it held advantages that raw production tallies could not capture. The Hurricane and the Spitfire were serious, well-designed fighting aircraft, armed substantially and flown by pilots whose training was increasingly rigorous. German planners, relying on intelligence assessments shaped by the chaos of the French campaign, had constructed a picture of the RAF as a force near collapse. That picture missed a great deal. Britain had also outpaced Germany in one area whose strategic importance would prove decisive in ways that neither side had fully anticipated. Radar, still relatively young as a technology, still being extended and refined in the months leading up to the battle, gave the defenders a capability that their opponents, for all their resources, had not replicated in any comparable form. It allowed ground controllers to detect incoming formations while those formations were still assembling over occupied France, to estimate their numbers and heading, and to direct intercepting squadrons toward the threat with a precision impossible by earlier methods. A fighter scrambled at the right moment, aimed toward the right sector, arrives over the target with altitude, fuel, and the tactical initiative, repeated across hundreds of engagements over the course of weeks. That difference would accumulate into something decisive. Geography, too, conferred an advantage that the arithmetic of first-line aircraft counts did not capture. An RAF pilot who bailed out over England might be recovered within hours, treated and returned to a cockpit within days. A German pilot who parachuted into British territory became a prisoner of war. One who came down in the Channel faced a different and grimmer calculation entirely. The logic of attrition, examined through this lens, shifted in Britain's favour. Every British airman who survived a parachute descent over his own homeland remained available to fly. Every German pilot who met the same fate was permanently subtracted from the Luftwaffe's operational strength. Hitler's failure to press an immediate, all-out air offensive in the weeks following Dunkirk provided something equally precious: time. In a nation mobilizing with genuine urgency, time translates directly into aircraft, into trained mechanics, into a support organization more capable of sustaining operations under the pressure of sustained aerial combat. Each week that passed was a week in which British factories produced fighters, ground crews serviced them, and the administrative infrastructure of fighter command refined its ability to keep those aircraft in the air at the rate the coming battle would demand. None of this was legible from the outside. The story that the world was reading, the story built on Rotterdam and Warsaw and the wreckage of Allied armies across the continent, still carried the message that Britain's chances were thin. That story was grounded in real events and real losses, and it was not wrong about the severity of the situation. The RAF entering the summer of 1940 was a force under serious strain. It was also a force that understood its position with unusual clarity, that had been shaped by years of careful and deliberate preparation, and that was actively strengthening itself against the moment when the main German assault arrived. The advantage of home ground reached beyond the recovery of individual pilots. RAF squadrons could return from combat to prepared airfields, refuel efficiently, and be airborne again within minutes. German formations crossing the Channel operated at or near the limits of their effective range, and those limits imposed constraints that no amount of bravery or tactical skill could simply overcome. There was a deeper asymmetry still, one that would only reveal itself as the fighting developed. The Luftwaffe had been built for a particular kind of war, under a particular strategic doctrine. That doctrine had served brilliantly in every campaign the Luftwaffe had yet fought. Whether it would serve equally well against an island nation defending its own skies was a question whose answer had never been tested. The summer ahead would provide it. Behind the gleaming facade of German air power, the rows of aircraft on well-ordered airfields, the factory floors that had so impressed Lindbergh and his fellow travelers, lay a production reality whose limitations would take time to fully assert themselves, but were already present as the battle approached. By the middle of 1940, at the precise moment the Luftwaffe was being assembled for the campaign it had been constructed to deliver, German industrial capacity was operating at a tempo that would have seemed modest for a nation fully committed to war. The explanation for this lay in a choice Hitler had made with characteristic confidence. He believed the war was, in its essential respects, already over. France had been defeated and occupied. The Low Countries were under German control. The British, isolated and apparently shaken, seemed unlikely to resist for long. The struggle, in the Führer's estimation, had been substantially decided, and the apparatus of state need not be placed on the kind of urgent, total footing that a genuinely extended conflict would eventually demand. Accelerating German industry, he had calculated, would alarm a population that had been repeatedly promised a swift and manageable war. Economic disruption, the visible curtailment of civilian comforts, the social signs of an economy stretched to its limits, these carried political costs that Hitler was reluctant to impose for what he expected would be a brief and concluding chapter. German industry continued, in mid-1940, at something close to a peacetime rhythm. The production lines that should have been running at maximum output for a military emergency were running at a level more appropriate to ordinary commercial demand. The consequences of that decision were not immediately apparent in the summer's opening engagements. The Luftwaffe entered the battle with a large and, by ordinary standards, well-supplied force. The gap being created was a gap in the future, in replacement aircraft, in reserve stocks, in the manufacturing capacity needed to absorb the losses a sustained campaign would inevitably produce. When those losses came, at a rate that surprised even experienced German commanders, the industrial machinery that should have been generating replacements had not yet shifted into a higher gear. The direction of what production did occur compounded the problem. In allocating scarce raw materials, the steel, the aluminium, the precision components that military aviation consumed in vast quantities, the German system had established an order of priorities that placed the army's requirements ahead of the air forces. The Luftwaffe received what remained after other services had taken their share. In the rapid, decisive campaigns of 1939 and 1940, against opponents that could be overwhelmed before replacement needs became acute, this ordering had worked well enough. In a sustained attritional battle against a well-organized and progressively improving opponent, it was a structural weakness that no operational skill could compensate for indefinitely. There was something almost paradoxical in the shape of this predicament. The propaganda that had served German strategic interests so effectively in the years before the war, the image of limitless production, of a military machine outpacing every competitor, had been absorbed in part by Germany's own leadership. The narrative of overwhelming strength made it easier to justify production levels that overwhelming strength would never have required. The Luftwaffe's reputation for inexhaustibility had helped excuse the very decisions that made it, in practice, less inexhaustible than its enemies believed. Britain's factories, operating under a very different sense of urgency, were telling a different story. Every additional aircraft that rolled off a British production line in those summer weeks narrowed invisibly the gap that German propaganda insisted could never be closed. The differential between British and German output, accumulating week by week, would matter more and more as losses mounted on both sides. The air campaign above England was going to be, in significant part, a test of industrial endurance, of which side could replace what it lost and sustain what it required. Germany entered that test with a formidable force and a manufacturing base that was not yet organized to sustain what that force was about to be asked to do. The gap between its reputation and its production reality was narrow in the summer of 1940. In a battle decided by margins, narrow gaps have a way of widening into decisive ones. At the center of the Luftwaffe's procurement difficulties stood a figure who was, in almost every measurable respect, the wrong man for the position he occupied. General Ernst Udet was a celebrated aviator. That much was beyond any reasonable dispute. He had flown in the First World War, assembled an impressive record of aerial victories, and earned his place in the German aviation pantheon through genuine courage and considerable skill in the cockpit. By all accounts, he was a man of personal warmth and considerable charm, convivial, irreverent, generous with his time and his company, possessed of the easy sociability that tends to form between men who have shared mortal danger in the air and survived it together. He was also, as the war would make unmistakably clear, neither a technical genius nor an administrator of any consequential ability. In the role he had been assigned, these were not incidental deficiencies. Hitler had decided in early 1938 that Udet was the ideal candidate to oversee the Luftwaffe's technical development, to guide the decisions about which aircraft were procured, which designs were advanced through the development process, and how the priorities of production were established. The decision owed considerably more to personal connection than to any systematic assessment of aptitude. Udet had served alongside Goering in the Richthofen flying circus during the previous war, and the bond formed in that environment carried lasting weight. The Reich Marshal trusted him with the easy confidence of long familiarity. Hitler, for his part, identified in Udet a pilot of the first order and extended that confidence, without much examination, into domains where it had no particular basis. The department Udet inherited was already substantial. Under the accelerating pressure of war preparations, it expanded rapidly. 9 departments became 28. The range of responsibilities now falling within his authority was immense, covering aircraft development, engine specifications, armament decisions, and production scheduling, a domain that would have challenged an experienced industrial administrator working under ideal conditions. Udet was neither experienced as an administrator nor working under ideal conditions. Decisions that should have taken days stretched into months. Department heads pressing for resolution of urgent technical and procurement matters found themselves waiting for answers that did not arrive on any predictable schedule. Udet preferred other conversations, unhurried discussions with colleagues about the theoretical possibilities of future aircraft, their projected performance envelopes, the elegant solutions that engineering might one day provide to problems that were still, at that point, largely imaginary. The immediate, prosaic, and often frustrating work of deciding what could be produced now, in what quantities, and according to what timeline held far less appeal. Even the formal conferences convened with Goering to address the Luftwaffe's pressing operational requirements had a tendency to lose their way. What had been called to resolve concrete problems of procurement and readiness would drift, by degrees, into long and comfortable sessions of reminiscence. 2 old aviators talking about the air battles of a previous war, while the urgent questions of the present one accumulated in the waiting rooms outside. The Luftwaffe suffered for it. Technical decisions that should have accelerated promising aircraft designs were deferred or made erratically. Production targets were missed. New models that might have given German air power capabilities it sorely needed arrived too late, victims of an approval process that moved at its own unhurried pace. When the Luftwaffe's internal difficulties began to surface as the campaign in the West concluded, and the complexities of fighting Britain became apparent, Udet's position became untenable. Goering, who had championed him, and Erhard Milch, shrewd, capable, and the man who in practical terms decided what aircraft were built and in what numbers, turned on the man they had elevated. Udet was made the vessel for blame that had multiple, more diffuse origins. The pressure applied to him was sustained and merciless. He took his own life a year after the Battle of Britain. The farewell note found near his body was addressed to Goering, still in the old language of wartime comradeship. "Iron Man," it read, "you deserted me." It was a few words carrying more weight than their number suggested, the final statement of a man elevated beyond his capacities, sustained there while the institution around him deteriorated, and then discarded when the deterioration could no longer be hidden. Beneath the administrative failures that cost the Luftwaffe so much lay something more fundamental, a flaw woven into the very conception of what the German Air Force was designed to accomplish. The men who had built the Luftwaffe in the years before the war had proceeded from a vision that was, within its own terms, coherent and well-reasoned. The Luftwaffe in that vision existed to serve the ground campaign, to operate as the aerial dimension of a land army, striking what the army could not reach and clearing the way for what the army intended to do. Its purpose was destruction of enemy air power on the ground, disruption of communications and supply lines, and the flexible, responsive support of armored spearheads advancing at the speed of a blitzkrieg. That vision had produced a force of formidable, genuine capability. Dive bombers capable of placing ordnance on specific targets with a precision that level bombing at altitude could not approach. Medium bombers fast enough to operate within the tempo of a rapidly moving ground campaign. An air force designed for speed, coordination, and the integration of air and land power that German doctrine had developed more thoroughly than any other military in the world. In Poland, it worked with devastating effectiveness. In Norway, the same capacity for decisive aerial intervention was demonstrated again. In France and the Low Countries, the Luftwaffe was the aerial component of a military combination that overran Western Europe in weeks, leaving observers to search, largely in vain, for historical precedents adequate to describe what had happened. Britain was another kind of problem entirely, compelling an island nation to accept defeat, one that possessed a functioning government, a navy of significant strength, and a population whose spirit had not been broken by the physical presence of occupying forces, required something the Luftwaffe had never been built to provide. It required the sustained, systematic destruction of industrial capacity, of port facilities and supply infrastructure, of the economic and social foundations that sustained a modern state's ability to wage war across an extended period of time. It required, in the plainest terms, strategic bombing, the ability to carry substantial bomb loads over considerable distances, to strike targets deep inside a country, and to continue that campaign for as long as the target nation's will or capacity to resist endured. For that purpose, long-range heavy bombers were essential. They were aircraft the Luftwaffe did not possess. The roots of that absence reached back to a single death. General Walter Wever, the Luftwaffe's first chief of staff, had understood the requirement with unusual clarity and had argued for it persistently. He had set in motion a program calling for the development of 4-engine heavy bombers capable, in his own description, of flying right around Britain under combat conditions, aircraft that could reach any point in the British Isles carrying a meaningful bomb load and return to base. The program had genuine momentum behind it because Weaver himself drove it. In 1936, he was killed in an air crash. With him went the institutional force that had kept the heavy bomber program alive. His successors did not share his strategic convictions with equal commitment, or did not act on them with equal energy. The program slowed and effectively stopped. Resources, engineering attention, and political momentum that might have produced a long-range strategic bombing fleet were redirected. The Germans did eventually develop an aircraft intended to fill that role, the Heinkel 177. It was the only aircraft in the Luftwaffe's order of battle that could realistically be called a strategic bomber, but it was plagued by an intractable and dangerous problem. Its paired engines had an alarming tendency to catch fire, sometimes fatally for the crews aboard. The Heinkel 177 was not operational at the time of the Battle of Britain. It would not become so until 1944. The Luftwaffe that assembled over the French coast in the summer of 1940 was a powerful instrument built for a specific kind of warfare, now being asked to wage a categorically different one. That mismatch between design and demand, between the war the force had been built for and the war it was now required to fight, would assert itself quietly but persistently across every phase of the campaign to come. The aircraft that carried the Luftwaffe's offensive weight across the Channel were, for the most part, machines that had been shaped by a doctrine of tactical support and rapid movement, machines that had excelled in the campaigns they were built for, and that now faced a theatre with fundamentally different demands. Competent, proven, and in some cases genuinely impressive within their original purpose, they nonetheless carried limitations whose significance would become clearer as the summer advanced. The most capable of the available German medium bombers was the Junkers 88. It was a fast aircraft by the standards of 1940, robustly constructed, and possessed of a range extending to 1,500 miles, a figure that made it considerably more versatile than its contemporaries. Those who flew it respected its performance, and the engineering that had produced it reflected genuine ambition. The difficulty was one of timing. At the moment the Battle of Britain began, the Junkers 88 was still arriving in significant numbers from the production lines. The quantities available fell well short of what a sustained strategic campaign would have demanded. The aircraft best suited to the offensive's requirements was present in the fleet in numbers that constrained its effect. The burden of the bombing campaign fell instead on two aircraft that had been the backbone of German medium bomber operations for several years. The Dornier 17 and the Heinkel 111 both had served ably in the campaigns they were designed for. Tactical strikes in support of ground forces advancing at the pace of the Blitzkrieg, at ranges that reflected the kind of warfare Germany had prepared to fight. Both shared a pattern of vulnerability that RAF fighter pilots would exploit consistently. They could be attacked from certain angles with considerable effectiveness, and in those angles the British fighters found repeated openings. The Dornier 17 had begun its existence as a design intended for commercial mail and passenger service, a narrow, purposeful silhouette that had given it the popular name of the flying pencil. Its conversion to a military bomber retained something of that original economy of form. It was not a large aircraft, and its bomb capacity reflected that. Against the dispersed, resilient targets that a major industrial nation presented, The tonnage a single Dornier 17 could deliver in one mission limited the cumulative damage any given raid could achieve. The Heinkel 111 was more substantial, larger in dimension, and carrying a somewhat greater bomb load. It had been among the more impressive aircraft of the Spanish Civil War, where its performance had seemed genuinely formidable against the opposition it encountered. The years between had shifted the terms of comparison. Entering the Battle of Britain, the Heinkel 111 flew against an air defense organized on principles and equipped with tools that Spanish operations had not prepared it to face. The weaknesses that had gone largely unexploited in earlier campaigns were now being probed by opponents who understood exactly where to look. Both aircraft labored under range constraints that shaped what they could realistically be asked to do. Flying from bases in northern France, they could reach southern and southeastern England without too much difficulty. Targets further north, the industrial concentrations of the Midlands, the cities of the north, pressed against the edges of their effective operating radius. Even within their comfortable range, they arrived over their targets carrying fuel margins that allowed little time for the kind of extended tactical maneuvering that contested airspace required. The question of fighter escort compounded everything. A bomber formation crossing to Britain without adequate protection was a formation in serious difficulty. The RAF's operational doctrine was explicit. The bombers were the primary targets, and disrupting the bombing was the principal objective of every interception. The medium bombers of the Luftwaffe needed consistent, capable escort, and, as would become apparent, providing it was far more difficult than it appeared on the planning maps. In the weeks ahead, the crews of these aircraft would fly through some of the most dangerous air above Europe since the previous war's Western Front. They would demonstrate a steadiness under fire that earned the respect of their opponents and sustain losses that would have halted campaigns fought under earlier standards. But the aircraft themselves and the structural limitations they carried could not be transcended by the courage of the men inside them. Among all the aircraft the Luftwaffe brought to the summer's campaign, none arrived with a reputation more fearsome, and none suffered a more complete reversal of fortune once the fighting over Britain began, than the Junkers 87. It was known widely as the Stuka, and in the 3 years of operational service behind it, the aircraft had accumulated a record that made its name, in the minds of those who had faced it, synonymous with a particular kind of aerial terror. The aircraft's lineage included an American predecessor, Ernst Udet, on a visit to the United States before the war, had watched a Curtiss Hell diver demonstrate the dive bombing technique, a method of attack in which the aircraft committed to a near vertical descent directly at its target, releasing its bomb at the lowest safe point, and had returned to Germany determined to develop a German version of his own. What emerged from that ambition was a single-engine aircraft designed around the diving attack as its defining characteristic. Once committed to the descent, the pilot could hold the machine precisely on course, making small corrections with a control and accuracy that level bombing from altitude, subject to wind, drift, and ballistics, could rarely approach. The Stuka, in this sense, was less a conventional bomber than a guided delivery system, a human-piloted weapon pointed at the thing it intended to destroy. Accuracy was only part of what the aircraft offered. Its designers had fitted the Stuka with external vanes on the landing gear, which as the dive accelerated produced a rising, unearthly shriek quite unlike the ordinary sound of a descending aircraft. That sound was heard from below before the bombs arrived. On open ground, aboard ships, in the streets of cities under attack, it preceded destruction with a psychological announcement that could produce panic even before damage occurred. The Stuka had been designed to destroy and to terrify, and in the campaigns that preceded Britain, it accomplished both. Against the opponents it had faced before crossing the Channel, it thrived. Polish warships in the Baltic fell to its precise attacks. Polish troop formations on the open plains encountered a specificity of aerial attack that ground-based artillery of the era could not replicate. British transport ships off Norway and Allied infantry in Belgium and France found the Stuka lethal and deeply demoralizing. The trails of shattered ships and broken defensive positions that marked its path across those campaigns were evidence enough of what the aircraft could accomplish against opponents unable to counter it effectively. Over Britain, everything changed. The reason was embedded in the very mechanics of the attack that had made the Stuka so effective. The diving approach that gave the aircraft its accuracy required the pilot to commit fully and early, to hold a long, predictable descent along a path that an attentive defending pilot could anticipate and intercept. There was no adequate defensive armament to beat off a fighter approaching from behind once the dive was underway. Compounding the problem, the bomb load was carried externally beneath the fuselage rather than in an internal bay, and the air resistance this created slowed the descent significantly. A Stuka in its attack dive was moving at no more than 150 miles an hour, and a Spitfire or Hurricane closing from the rear held every advantage a pursuing aircraft could want. One RAF pilot described the effect concisely. A Stuka peeling off into its attack drew fighters the way honey draws flies. The image was accurate. Defending pilots knew what the aircraft would do, could position themselves accordingly, and had ample time to execute an attack before the dive concluded. The Stuka's crew, committed to the geometry of the descent, had limited ability to respond. The results, as the campaign developed, were devastating for German dive bomber operations. Stukas were lost in numbers that alarmed Luftwaffe commanders. Crews who had operated with hard-earned confidence over Poland and France found themselves in a theatre where their aircraft's previously celebrated attack profile had become a liability rather than an advantage. The Stuka had excelled against opponents who could not adequately answer it. Against a modern fighter force operating under a sophisticated ground-controlled air defense network, the same aircraft, flying the same attacks, produced a radically different result. It was an instrument perfectly suited to one kind of war, meeting a different kind entirely. The Messerschmitt 109 was, by the standards of 1940, an aircraft of genuine distinction. Its maximum speed of 354 miles an hour placed it among the fastest fighters in operational service anywhere in the world. In open, unencumbered combat, fighter against fighter, or fighter closing on an enemy bomber, it was a capable, responsive machine whose pilots had learned to trust it through the accumulated experience of multiple campaigns. It climbed well, it dived with authority, and it was armed substantially enough to be dangerous in almost any tactical situation it was likely to encounter. The difficulties the Me-109 brought to the Battle of Britain were, for the most part, difficulties created by decisions made far above the level of the aircraft itself. The Luftwaffe's pre-war production strategy had weighted investment toward bombers and ground support aircraft, reflecting a doctrine built around the close integration of air and land power. Fighters in that framework were secondary instruments. The consequence, as the summer of 1940 approached, was a genuine shortage of Me-109C relative to the volume of tasks they were now being asked to perform simultaneously. There were not enough to meet every requirement, and the replacement pipeline the organization responsible for supplying new aircraft as losses accumulated had not been built with the redundancy that sustained attrition demands. There was also the matter of how the aircraft was being employed. Designed as a free-ranging interceptor, quick and aggressive, built to dictate the terms of any engagement it entered, the Mi-109 was being pressed into service as a close escort to the German bomber formations crossing the Channel. The pilots who flew them understood the tactical damage this caused, tied to the slow, ponderous progress of Heinkel 111's and Dornier 17's, constrained to speeds and altitudes suited to the bombers rather than to themselves. They surrendered the initiative that had been their greatest asset. They could not pursue. They could not maneuver freely. One German pilot, searching for an image to capture the frustration, compared it to yoking a thoroughbred to a task suited for an altogether different kind of animal. The Mi-109's most consequential limitation, however, was one that no adjustment of tactics or command philosophy could resolve. It did not carry enough fuel. A single-engine aircraft, the Mi-109 held fuel sufficient for approximately 80 minutes of flight. The geometry of each mission consumed that margin with brutal efficiency. From bases in northern France, the aircraft needed roughly 30 minutes to climb to operational altitude and cross to the English coast. The return journey consumed an equivalent amount of time. What remained, approximately 20 minutes, was the entire window available for operations over England. 20 minutes was not a long time in which to escort a bomber formation, engage defending fighters, manage the sudden chaotic geometry of a developing aerial battle, and still retain enough fuel to ensure a safe return. The consequences accumulated steadily across the campaign. Large numbers of Mi-109's that were never engaged by British fighters simply failed to return. They ran out of fuel over the Channel, or came down short of the French coast. Lost to arithmetic rather than combat, pilots began carrying a constant low-level anxiety about their fuel states, a distraction that no serious fighter pilot can afford, and that anxiety had its own effect on tactical decision-making. Seeking to compensate for the Mi-109's limited reach, the Luftwaffe had developed a second fighter, the Messerschmitt 110, a twin-engine aircraft with nearly twice the Mi-109's range. It had attracted Goering's considerable confidence. He announced that Mi-110S would form the nucleus of elite destroyer units, a strategic fighter force of exceptional capability that would sweep the RAF from the sky. The announcement was premature. The Mi-110's maximum speed of 365 miles an hour was technically higher than the Mi-109's. Against the Spitfire, it was approximately 20 miles an hour slower, and in fighter versus fighter combat that margin is not narrow. The aircraft was large and easy to identify. It lacked the agility that close aerial combat consistently rewarded. Rather than relieving the Mi-109 of its difficult escort burden, the Mi-110 found itself requiring its own protection. One solution had compounded the problem it was meant to solve. Two fighters, one with insufficient range, one with insufficient speed. Between them, they defined the outer limits of what German air power could accomplish over England. Despite everything, the structural design flaws, the production shortfalls, the range constraints hobbling its fighters, the inadequacy of its available bombers for sustained strategic work, the German air armada assembling in occupied France through the summer of 1940 was a formidable force by any honest reckoning. The men who had built it and the men who would fly it had genuine, experience-grounded reasons to believe it would succeed. Luftwaffe crews carried with them the particular confidence that comes from an unbroken record of success. They had fought across Spain, where German pilots had tested tactics and aircraft against actual opponents under operational conditions. They had swept through Poland, through Norway, through the skies above France and the Low Countries. They had watched opposing air forces scramble desperately and fall away. The collective memory of the force was a memory of victories, and victories repeatedly confirmed, absorbed into the institutional culture of an organization, are among the most durable sources of fighting spirit that any military can possess. The aircraft were ready. The airfields were prepared. The men who would fly were seasoned, capable, and led by commanders who had reason to trust their own judgment. Senior leadership shared that confidence and possessed additional reasons for it. Intelligence assessments flowing up through the Luftwaffe's command structure consistently described Fighter Command as a force in serious difficulty. German analysts had constructed a picture of the RAF that presented it as perilously weakened, its reserves nearly exhausted, its capacity for sustained resistance severely compromised by the battles in France. The information reaching German headquarters suggested that between the Luftwaffe and an uncontested approach to Britain's airfields and cities stood only a thin and crumbling line. Hermann Göring, who had built the Luftwaffe in the years after the armistice dissolved the old Imperial Air Service, regarded its capabilities with a proprietorial assurance that tolerated very little qualification. His force had performed, campaign after campaign, precisely as he had predicted and promised. Now he stood at what seemed the final chapter, the defeat of the last serious obstacle between Germany and the consolidation of everything the previous years of warfare had built toward. This was a fatal miscalculation. The phrase deserves a moment of quiet reflection because it describes something more consequential than a single tactical error. The assessments German planners had accepted about the RAF's true condition were wrong in ways that would compound each other over weeks of fighting. The assumptions about what the Luftwaffe could accomplish against a prepared island nation in conditions quite unlike those of any continental campaign were wrong in ways that would magnify the cost of those first errors, and the underlying confidence, the deep, repeated institutional assumption that what had worked in Poland and France could be replicated against a different kind of opponent in a fundamentally different theatre, was perhaps the most significant error of all. The RAF had genuinely suffered in France and at Dunkirk. That portion of the German intelligence picture was accurate, but the picture stopped where reality did not. Fighter Command had been partially rebuilt in the weeks since Dunkirk. Factories were running with urgency. Pilots, though constrained in number, were flying capable aircraft within a well-conceived and increasingly practiced air defense system. Radar was watching every approach. The intelligence apparatus at Bletchley Park was reading German intentions before German aircraft left the ground. What the Luftwaffe was advancing toward was a force that had spent months organizing itself for precisely the battle it was about to face, a force whose actual condition bore little resemblance to the exhausted remnant that German assessments described. Confidence born of legitimate success is understandable, and within limits it is a military virtue, but confidence that accepts convenient intelligence without subjecting it to rigorous examination, that discounts complications because the overall narrative feels compelling, that confidence becomes something else. It becomes the condition under which outcomes that seemed impossible begin to happen. The Luftwaffe crossed the Channel with the working assumption that the hardest part of the contest was already behind it. That assumption would be tested across every phase of the battle that followed. would be strained beyond what anyone on the German side had prepared for, and would ultimately break at a cost that neither side at the outset had fully imagined. The Royal Air Force that entered the summer of 1940 carried with it the visible weight of what the previous months had cost. In the campaign that had unfolded across the Low Countries and France at the speed of the German armoured advance, British air forces had been in continuous and often desperate action, operating sometimes at a pace and under conditions that made any kind of coherent organisation difficult to sustain. The losses had been real, substantial, and in some periods severe. In the first 3 days of the German Blitzkrieg alone, 232 RAF fighters had been shot down, destroyed on the ground, or captured before they could be evacuated. As the campaign accelerated and Allied defensive lines collapsed, the numbers continued to climb. Britain was losing aircraft and pilots at a rate that, sustained over any extended period, would have reduced fighter command to nothing. The appeals arriving in London from commanders in France were urgent in the way that military appeals born of genuine desperation tend to be: immediate, specific, and impossible to dismiss without feeling the weight of what dismissal meant for the men in the field. More fighters might stabilize a line that was breaking. More fighters might buy the time that would allow some kind of reorganization, some recovery of military coherence. From French generals watching their positions dissolve, and from British commanders alongside them, the requests came with a frequency and force that was hard to resist. Prime Minister Churchill, moved by the human scale of the catastrophe unfolding across the Channel, and by his profound personal commitment to the alliance with France, had promised that he would, if necessary, cut Britain's own defences to the bone in order to send the aircraft that were being asked for. Air Chief Marshal Dowding understood exactly what keeping that promise would mean. He had calculated, with the care of a man who had spent years determining what a minimum adequate fighter force for British air defence actually required, that sending further aircraft to France at this stage of the campaign would not alter the outcome on the continent. France, in his assessment, was already lost as a military proposition. The only genuine remaining question was whether Britain would be lost with it. If the fighters crossed the Channel, he advised Churchill, there would be nothing left to defend the British Isles. The catastrophe would simply relocate. He made his case with a visual tool whose simplicity gave it unusual force. On the 16th of May, he brought to a cabinet meeting a graph showing the RAF's losses over the preceding weeks and projecting what the line would produce if the current rate of attrition continued. The graph's trajectory was unambiguous. The line fell towards zero. Defeat in France, Dowding told the assembled ministers, would involve the complete and irremediable defeat of this country. But if an adequate fighter force were retained at home, if the Royal Navy remained intact and ground forces were suitably organised, Britain could carry on the war alone for some time, perhaps indefinitely. The fighters were not sent. They did, however, provide air cover for the evacuation from Dunkirk, engaging the Luftwaffe above the beaches and the harbour approaches while the ships moved back and forth across the Channel. The fighting was intense and costly. 106 fighters and 75 pilots were lost in those engagements. Soldiers rescued from the sand were bitter about the level of protection they had received. Many of them could not see from the beaches what was happening at altitude above them. By the time the last Dunkirk ships returned to British ports on June 5th, Fighter Command's serviceable strength stood at 466 aircraft, with 36 more held in reserve. Germany's planners, guided by their intelligence assessments, concluded that the RAF had effectively spent itself. What remained was, in their estimation, a final decisive blow to complete what the French campaign had begun. What those assessments could not measure was the force quietly reconstituting itself behind the numbers, a force diminished, strained, and still standing. Hugh Caswell Tremenhere Dowding was 58 years old in the summer of 1940, and the nickname that had attached itself to him across a long and distinguished career, Stuffy, was, like many nicknames, simultaneously apt and misleading. It described his private habits accurately enough. He was a vegetarian in an institution that celebrated the officers' mess. He did not drink. He spent his quieter hours watching birds and had, over the course of his adult life, developed a sincere and serious interest in spiritualism. In the social world of the Royal Air Force, where conviviality of a particular kind was the expected register, these habits set him apart. He was a man his colleagues found difficult to know easily, and many of them never quite managed it. But the implication that Stuffy carried, of rigidity, of attachment to old methods, of minds closed to the new, was wrong about the things that mattered. Dowding was one of the most forward-looking officers in the service. He had flown with the Royal Flying Corps on the Western Front during the previous war, had encountered military aviation at its most primitive and dangerous, and had drawn from that experience not a reverence for the way things had been done, but a precise understanding of what air power actually required to function effectively. In the decades since, he had been among the most consistent advocates for modernizing Britain's air defences, pressing, sometimes against considerable institutional resistance, for the equipment, the organisation, and the approach that a serious national air defence demanded. It was Dowding who had fought hardest, over years, to equip Fighter Command with the most capable interceptors British industry could produce. He had pushed for the Hurricane and the Spitfire at times when more cautious voices in the Air Ministry were still debating whether such investments were justified. Once those aircraft were in service, he turned his attention to the details, the unglamorous, specific, easily dismissed details that separate aircraft which survive a dogfight from aircraft which do not. Bulletproof windshields were among those details. The Air Ministry classified them as an unnecessary expense. Dowding's response to that classification was characteristically direct. If the organized criminal enterprises of Chicago found it worthwhile to protect their members with bulletproof glass, then Royal Air Force pilots engaging a major military power deserved the same provision as a minimum. The windshields were fitted. He had also worked to attract into the cockpits of those aircraft the kinds of young men who would be needed there, people of intelligence and quickness of mind, with a particular combination of physical capability and mental composure that aerial combat consistently rewarded. The recruiting campaigns he encouraged reached beyond the traditional social pools from which the RAF had historically drawn its officers. Against Churchill's deep emotional commitment to France in the spring of 1940, Dowding brought arithmetic. The graph he carried to the cabinet in May was, in its quiet way, an act of considerable courage, a different kind of courage from the kind displayed in the air, but no less necessary and perhaps harder to sustain. It required standing before the Prime Minister and a room full of ministers who were feeling the human pull of an ally's desperation and saying, with all the authority available to him, that sentiment could not be allowed to determine what happened to the aircraft. He had been right, and being right under those circumstances demanded the kind of sustained, unglamorous intellectual work, knowing the numbers, understanding their meaning, trusting that understanding when the pressure to relent was strongest, that history tends to undervalue because it leaves no visible wreckage, and produces no dramatic image. The organization Dowding had built, the radar network, the sector stations, the carefully managed allocation of his limited forces, was itself an expression of that same sustained, methodical intelligence. He had not improvised a defense in the weeks before the battle. He had been constructing one for years. The summer of 1940 was where that construction would be tested. In the days immediately after the last Dunkirk ships reached British ports, the situation facing Fighter Command was one in which the margin between holding on and losing the capacity to hold on was thin enough to make careful people genuinely anxious. The force that had survived the fighting in France and on the Channel approaches was real. It was still operational, and it was led by a man who had done everything within his power to preserve it. But it was also markedly smaller than it had been, and the Luftwaffe that would soon be turning its full attention toward Britain was not. Two things intervened that changed what might otherwise have been an irretrievable calculus. The first was time. Hitler's failure to press an immediate and all-out air offensive against Britain in the weeks following Dunkirk provided the most valuable commodity that a recovering force can receive. The reasons for that pause were complex: political calculations, uncertainty about British intentions, perhaps an expectation that London would accept some form of settlement. But the effect was straightforward. Every day that passed without a sustained German air campaign was a day in which the RAF could repair, replenish, and reorganize. The second was a man. William Maxwell Aitken, Lord Beaverbrook, was 61 years old when Churchill appointed him Minister of Aircraft Production in mid-May of 1940. He was Canadian-born, self-made through the newspaper industry, possessed of a restless and formidable energy, and thoroughly unimpressed by institutional inertia in all its forms. Churchill's decision to place him in charge of the industrial effort on which Fighter Command's survival ultimately depended was one of the more consequential appointments of the war. Beaverbrook approached his new responsibilities in the manner of a man who has decided that every standard process represents an obstacle to be circumvented rather than a system to be respected. He imposed a 7-day working week on the factories under his authority. He pushed suppliers, cut through the approval chains that governed procurement, and concentrated the full attention of his ministry on a single measurable objective: putting more fighter aircraft into RAF hands faster than the losses were removing them. Where bureaucratic sequence slowed the effort, he shortened the sequence. Where a supplier was underperforming, he found another. Where a technical problem was being managed at a pace suited to peacetime, he applied the pressure of a man who understood that the alternative to speed was losing. He found material in places that no formal inventory had anticipated. The production of aircraft required aluminum in quantities that strained conventional supply. Beaverbrook appealed directly to the women of Britain, asking them to contribute household items containing the metal to the national effort: pots and pans, kettles, vacuum cleaners, bathroom fittings. They arrived in a volume that was remarkable, a physical expression of a population that understood with unusual clarity what was being asked of it and why. The results were striking. In the month following Dunkirk, British factories produced 446 new fighter aircraft, a figure that exceeded by at least 100 what German industry delivered to the Luftwaffe in the same period. The gap between British and German aircraft production, which German planners had assumed would consistently favor Germany, had been reversed. British output would exceed German fighter production for the remainder of the war. The effort extended well beyond the largest facilities. Across Britain, aircraft components were being manufactured in garages, small workshops and industrial units that had no prior connection to the aviation industry. The supply chain linking those producers to the main assembly operations was improvised and imperfect, but it functioned. Aircraft arrived at RAF squadrons faster than German intelligence could account for. From Canada and the United States, additional machines were beginning to arrive. The numbers from those sources were limited in the summer of 1940, but they carried significance beyond their count, evidence that Britain's industrial reach extended past its own shores. The force assembling to meet the Luftwaffe was stronger than it had been at Dunkirk. The margin was narrow, but narrow margins held consistently are how battles are decided. The fighter aircraft of the Royal Air Force came in 3 distinct types, each with its own character, its own particular relationship with the technical limits of the age, and its own role in the defense that was now being organized against what was coming. Together they formed the material front line of that defense, the machines through whose performance the outcome of the summer would in very large part be determined. The Hawker Hurricane had been with Fighter Command since before the war began. It was a solid, dependable aircraft, not elegant in the way the Spitfire would come to be regarded, but reliable in the way that pilots under pressure deeply value. In its early versions, it carried 8 machine guns arranged in the wings, giving it substantial firepower against the large, relatively slow airframes of German medium bombers. Later marks added 4 more machine guns, and by 1940 some Hurricanes were being equipped with 4 20mm cannons, a significant increase in destructive capacity that made the aircraft especially useful against formations of Heinkel 111S and Dornier 17S. In that role, against the bombers, it was well suited. Its limitations against the Messerschmitt 109 were real. In outright speed, the Hurricane was at a modest disadvantage. Its operational ceiling was approximately 1,000 feet lower than the Me-109 service ceiling, which mattered in the high-altitude geometry of fighter versus fighter combat. It also carried a blind spot in the upper rear arc of the pilot's field of view, a gap that an attentive enemy could exploit if he knew where to look. These were manageable flaws in the context of a well-organized defense, but they were flaws that shaped how the aircraft could most effectively be used. The Spitfire, which was progressively replacing the Hurricane in the RAF's order of battle, was a more refined machine, marginally faster than the Me-109. It held a genuine advantage in maneuverability. It could turn inside its opponent in a dogfight, reaching a position behind a pursuing German fighter with an ease that no Me-109 pilot could answer. German airmen who encountered the Spitfire and initially treated it as just another British aircraft learned quickly to revise that assessment. The Spitfire carried its own significant vulnerability, however, one whose origins lay in a bureaucratic failure with an almost novelistic quality. The aircraft's engine lacked a fuel injection system. When the Spitfire entered a steep dive, fuel delivery to the engine became erratic and the engine cut out. For a pilot trying to follow a diving opponent, this was a serious operational disadvantage, the moment of pursuit becoming, instead, a moment of silence where the engine had been. The absence of that fuel injection mechanism traced back to a specific and improbable event. In early 1940, a British aircraft engineer with an intelligence background was sitting in a cafe in Belgrade when an unknown individual approached him and handed over a paper parcel. Inside the parcel was a fuel injection pump removed from a Messerschmitt 109. an item the engineer recognized immediately for what it was and what it meant. He passed it to officials at the British Embassy in the Yugoslav capital. Those officials forwarded it onward by ordinary post, routing the parcel through Italy on its way to the Air Ministry in London. It never reached its destination. What had been briefly and accidentally within Britain's grasp was lost somewhere along that route, and RAF pilots would spend the battle managing around a deficiency whose solution had passed through their hands. The third aircraft in Fighter Command's inventory was the Boulton-Paul Defiant, a two-seater of approximately the Hurricane's dimensions, distinguished by an unusual armament arrangement. It carried no forward-firing guns. Its firepower came from a powered turret mounted behind the cockpit, with 4 machine guns offering a wide arc of coverage to the rear and sides. Against German pilots who mistook it for a Hurricane and attacked from behind, the Defiant was briefly devastating, delivering a response from an angle the attacker had considered safe. Once German pilots identified it and understood its configuration, its limitations became apparent: slow in the climb, restricted in maneuverability, unable to press any offensive action of its own. The Defiant found daylight operations increasingly costly. Britain's bombers flew against targets in Germany and against the channel ports where German invasion shipping was gathering. Their contribution, though it achieved some effect in diverting German resources, was secondary to the main event. The defense of Britain rested on its fighters. The defense Britain was organizing against what was coming rested on more than aircraft and the men who flew them. Running beneath the visible apparatus of Fighter Command, woven through its structure and enabling the decisions made at its center, was a network of technologies and intelligences that the outside world had not fully grasped, and that Germany, for all its sophistication, had not adequately prepared to counter. Radar had been developing in Britain since the mid-1930s. By 1940, a chain of stations stretched around the coastline from the Orkney Islands in Scotland's far north to the Isle of Wight in the Channel, with the heaviest concentration running along the south and east coasts of England. British officials described it, with quiet satisfaction, as an invisible bastion. The phrase was accurate. The stations could detect aircraft rising into the sky at distances of up to 150 miles, estimate their numbers and track their heading, and relay that information to the central command apparatus in time for defending fighters to be directed toward the threat before it arrived over England. Germany was aware that Britain had a radar system. They had developed their own, which they called Freya, after the Teutonic deity associated with warriors fallen in battle. In certain technical respects, German radar development had at some periods been ahead of British. By the spring of 1939, German concern about British progress was sufficient to prompt an intelligence-gathering mission. Their great airship, the Graf Zeppelin, was dispatched across the North Sea to cruise the English coast and record the frequencies and ranges of whatever radar transmissions it encountered. Something failed aboard the airship, almost certainly the receiving equipment in the gondola, and the crew detected nothing at all. British radar operators, watching the enormous signature of the Zeppelin across their screens, were quietly delighted when intercepted signals confirmed that the mission had returned empty-handed. The misapplication of German radar told its own instructive story. Control of the program had been assigned to the Navy, whose officers valued it chiefly as a tool for ocean reconnaissance. They had not thought carefully about its significance for air combat. Britain's radar advocates had thought of almost nothing else. The physicist Robert Watson Watt and the scientific advisor Sir Henry Tizard had spent years building the case for radar as the indispensable foundation of an integrated air defense. working through 1939 and into 1940 to extend the chain's coverage and sharpen its accuracy. Their efforts faced internal opposition. Professor Frederick Lindemann, Churchill's principal scientific advisor, was deeply skeptical of the radar program, partly from competitive rivalry with Tizard, his on-time friend and now his professional antagonist, and preferred his own alternative approaches to detecting incoming aircraft. Had Churchill come to power before the outbreak of war, Lindemann's influence might have arrived in time to slow radar's development below the threshold of usefulness. By the summer of 1940, that moment had passed. The chain was operational, and no amount of internal skepticism could unmake what Watson Watt's team had already built. The nerve center of the system was Bentley Priory, an 18th century mansion northwest of London that had sheltered, across its long life, aristocrats, a hotel's guests, schoolgirls, and eventually abandonment. Now it was the most operationally important building in Britain. In its plotting room, members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force moved coloured symbols across a great illuminated map of southern England, updating the picture in real time as reports arrived from the radar stations along the coast and from the observer corps. Volunteers watching the sky from church towers and hilltops and coastal headlands, calling in what they saw. From a balcony above the plotting room, Dowding and his controllers watched it all and made their decisions. There was one final, closely guarded secret. Britain had acquired a machine capable of decrypting the Luftwaffe's encrypted radio communications before German aircraft left the ground. Before formations assembled over occupied France, transcripts of their signals were available at Fighter Command headquarters. Dowding knew in substantial measure what was coming before it arrived. By mid-July, the opposing forces were assembled. Göring's plan divided the campaign into 3 phases. First, controlling the channel and drawing the RAF into attritional combat. Second, destroying Britain's airfields and air infrastructure in a concentrated assault. And third, covering the seaborne invasion. Germany's 2 primary air fleets faced southern England. RAF Groups 11 and 12 held 640 combat-ready fighters between them, against 824 German fighters and 1,191 bombers. Dowding surveyed the figures quietly and observed that his young men would have to shoot down their opponents at a rate of 5 to 1. During the pre-battle weeks, German fighters had probed the coast, trying to draw the RAF up. Adolf Galland dived on what he took for an easy target, a Spitfire 1,000 feet below, and found it turning inside his pursuit until it disappeared. Werner Mölders reported the same experience, a British pilot slipping from his gun sight like an eel. Neither man was longer in any doubt about what lay ahead. On July 10th, over the strait that would become known as Hellfire Corner, a German reconnaissance pilot spotted a westbound convoy. The word came back to Colonel Fink at his clifftop command post. Vernichten, destroy. 70 aircraft crossed the channel. British radar saw them coming 30 minutes before they arrived. Squadrons scrambled. In less than 30 minutes of fighting, both sides recorded losses and, in their different ways, reasons for the convictions they were carrying into the weeks ahead. That evening, Fink and his pilots raised champagne glasses in a small garden and looked forward to what came next. The battle had begun in earnest.